Well, good afternoon or dobry wieczór and good evening for those participants currently in Uzbekistan and elsewhere in Central Asia. It's my very great pleasure to welcome you to this second spotlight on Uzbekistan from the Foreign Policy Centre. Look, this evening, this afternoon, we're examining 4 years of President Mirziyeyev's rule. Exactly 3 years ago, I was on my first visit to Uzbekistan and was lucky enough to hear President Mirziyoyev speaking live at the big conference in Samarkand. This evening, we're going to take stock on the current political and social situation in Uzbekistan, and we'll look at what has changed since 2016 and what hasn't changed, and we'll be assessing we'll be assessing the reform process and what's actually delivered and what it still has to deliver. We have an excellent panel of speakers this evening, and without further ado, I will introduce them to you. And after each panelist has spoken for approximately 6 or 7 minutes, there will be a Q&A session. If you would like to ask a question, please do it on the Q&A box on the Zoom screen, and then we will take your questions in groups for our panelists to respond to. Our first speaker this evening is Dilmurad Yusupov, who is a doctoral researcher in participation, inclusion and social change. He's currently applying research methods to analyse issues of social exclusion and marginalisation of disabled people and exploring ways of promoting community-based inclusive development in Uzbekistan. Dilmurad has also been an active volunteer in the voluntary sector in Uzbekistan, working with disabled people's organisations. And in 2016, he founded his own NGO. So over to you now, Dilmurad. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brian Sati. It's a great pleasure to be here with you, and I hope it will be a fruitful discussion and good questions. We'll receive good questions. I remember my contribution to the spotlight on Uzbekistan, and because I have had a long experience in this voluntary sector, as you said, and I've been looking through the development of the civil society in Uzbekistan, and I wrote a piece on the challenges that the NGOs in Uzbekistan are still facing. And this piece was in the middle of pandemic, and I also reflected on how COVID-19 pandemic influenced the development of the civil society. But analyzing the past 4 years of our new President Mirziyoyev, I think his policies are very great in terms of the development of the civil society. Like he signed his first decree in May 2018, which was on the radical improvement of the civil society institutions and trying to promote their contribution to the civil society development. But at the same time, I have been seeing that there is a kind of his decrees and his statements are not like necessarily reflected in practice, because sometimes at the bottom level, if at the higher level, his policies are very kind of inclusive and oriented towards the development of the civil society. But at the same time, NGOs and civil society activists are still facing some issues, including the first issue, which I've been highlighting, is registration of NGOs. The process is still very difficult. It's also from my own observation, because many civil society activists and human rights activists are facing these difficulties in registering their organizations. And I recently wrote an article about an NGO, Youth Volunteer Center, which is called Altan Qanot. They are trying to register their organization, and they have received already 18 rejections from the Minister of Justice, from the Tashkent City Minister of Justice. And I wrote about this piece, but there was no kind of feedback from the Minister of Justice. And but my own experience was after President Mirziyoyev came to rule in 2016, we managed to register our own organization, which is Shared Plus. We faced like 8 rejections, before trying to register our organization. And when he came to power in 2016, we wrote a letter to the virtual reception, to his virtual reception, and got a positive response. And our organization was registered very quickly. And I hope that there would be really kind of systematic change in registering civil society organizations. But because of these difficulties, or formal difficulties of registering the organizations and running their activities, many we are now kind of witnessing an emerging kind of virtual civic space. We can see bloggers activities, and all the civic activities are happening online, and we could also see it during the pandemic. And the pandemic had a very severe impact on the civil society institutions. And at the same time, it showed that the first initiative came from the civil society activists, like to help marginalized communities, to help vulnerable people. They organize their groups on Telegram, for example, or in social networks, and they try to help out like vulnerable communities, including disabled people. But at the same time, on 1st of April, the Ministry of Mahalla, our new Ministry of Mahalla and Family, they tried to intervene in the process and tried to kind of regulate this kind of activity. And this was kind of the first initiative that came from the grassroots level was, in my mind, it was suppressed somehow, because only state-related structures and government-organized NGOs had the right to kind of allocate resources and like help support during the pandemic. At the same time, I can see that there is the crucial issue, which has been discussed a lot this year, was a code on NGOs, a new code on NGOs. But this code, the development of this NGO code was postponed several times. And the civil society activists, they also came up with their own NGO code. Like there were two alternative kind of draft versions of this code developed by the civil society activists. But I didn't see the reaction from the Ministry of Justice and relevant government institutions on this code, on these versions of the code. And the pandemic influenced and delayed this process of adopting this new NGO code. And I'm hopeful that this NGO code will be adopted in close consultation with the civil society activists, and which will reflect and which will ease in the process of registration of NGOs and their activities. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Dilmurad. Our second speaker is Dilfuza Kurolova. Dilfuza joined the ICJ as a legal consultant for Uzbekistan in 2018, and she specialized in economic, social, and cultural rights. Previously, she was a lecturer on international law at Tashkent University of Law, and Dilfuza has worked for various national NGOs in Uzbekistan and has been a national consultant for various international organizations, including the World Bank, ILO, and UNICEF in Uzbekistan. Over to you, Dilfuza. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I will not be stopping on the things that Dilmurad has already covered, and maybe I will highlight only three main aspects of my observation being in Uzbekistan and working here on the judiciary. So one is now about the rule of law. So one of the important things in the judiciary sector is that in 2018, the government established, again, by the leadership of President, the Supreme Judiciary Council, which was the most important organization in judiciary, who is responsible for appointment of the judges. So before, it was not a single organization who would do this. Another thing is about the establishment of Supreme School of Judges, which is also important to note that there should be an institution who would be preparing qualified judges for the judiciary. And I think it's also one of the important things and developments in the judiciary sector. Of course, we should note about the freedom of political prisoners and closure of the most cruel prison, Jaslik, in the Republic of Uzbekistan. This is one of the greatest thing that would happen in the sphere and the field of human rights. And however, we still have issues with the rehabilitation and compensation for those who've been pardoned. This is one of the things that probably as a human rights community we shall work on further. But this is also one of the developments that we can see for last 4 or 3.5 years that would never happen before. Also, it's important to note that the quite challenging is the independence of judges and lawyers, and new law on advocatura, which is advocates and lawyers, have been now under the review, and I hope it will truly give the independence of lawyers and ensure the equality of arms in a fair trial in the courts. So the second thing that also Dilmurad touched upon was about the civic space, how the civil society can actually influence into the governance. So one of the novelties that I would really prize is the online platform where the government's organization has to post the draft laws before the adoption, and people actually can tell their opinion if they're okay with that or not, and express their willing on commenting these laws. So the public consultation is still happening online and offline space. Of course, another question is about the quality. Do they care, the government officials care or not? This is another separate part. But what is important is such platforms are created and such space has been given. Of course, another question is registration that Dilmurad was also mentioning. But we have to also prize that one of the human rights organizations, NGOs, Hukitayanch, has been registered this year in March, which is dealing specifically on human rights issues and has been registered by a former political prisoner. And the last but not the least, I would like to stop on gender-based violence and gender equality in Uzbekistan. So these, the two important laws for lawyers and for everyone who is working on GBV issues have been adopted in September 2019. And, this was one of the taboo topics in the country, where you could not even talk about the gender equality, you would not talk about the women's right, and not even about the special procedures, like special temporary measures, like quotas or any additional support. So in this line, I think these two important laws are providing the protection of women from perpetrators, and the government started open up and they even established the special rehabilitation centers where victims of domestic violence can call and go and seek for assistance, including legal assistance, then medical assistance and other assistance. Of course, the problem is that, again, when the Ministry of Mahala and Family Affairs have been created, the three other foundations, the bigger foundations, were disseminated, and they were jointly together mixed up in the one ministry. And of course, they're underfunded. And these rehabilitation centers are also run out financial assistance. That's why they cannot provide longer stay of victims in these centers. So victims cannot stay there for months, right? So like it will take they can stay there for up to 1 month. And I think this is also one of the challenges that these centers are facing now. And lastly, I think still the problem with the GBV or gender equality in Uzbekistan is about institutional discrimination that is happening, and also not readiness of the population to accept that there is a notion of gender equality. The bright example is for me, who gave the interview on gender equality and was severely online bullied by people, and they just started sending a tremendous comments, and there was a hate speech telling that there will be, you know, even a kill me, fine and kill. So this means that not even if the government is ready to promote gender equality because of, you know, there's a quota for the parliament, there is now quota for education in higher education, there's a quotas for at work, there's a security orders even for harassment cases at work. However, people in society might not be ready to accept that there is a notion of gender equality and there is a protection of victims of domestic violence. And that's why this civic space, again, is working hard to promote these notions. And in this line, the judiciary, I think it's an important part where they can adopt the laws, not adopt the law, but use the laws to protect it and provide with fair and equal remedies, effective remedies to those who have been violated or whose rights are violated. So I stop here and we'll be ready for any questions.
Thank you very much, Dilfuza. There was lots and lots in there that I would immediately like to ask you questions on, but we've got to move on to our third speaker, who is Professor Kristian Lasslett, who is Professor of Criminology at Ulster University and sits on the board of the International State Crime Initiative and is co-director of UzInvestigations. He is an investigative researcher who works on corruption and kleptocracy in Central Asia, Europe, and South Pacific. He has worked on particularly on how large-scale corruption shapes national and international political economy. And a small plug for your most recent book, which is Uncovering the Crimes of Urbanization, which was published 2 years ago by Routledge. Over to you, Professor Kristian.
Thank you very much for that very warm welcome. What I'd like to do today, just very quickly, is to look at some of the narratives that have been used to frame this process of transition from President Karimov to President Mirziyoyev, and to look at which of the narratives, the key narratives that are being used to frame this transition process, appears to be most plausible when looked at forensically from the evidence that's available, and certainly the kind of evidence we've been looking at UzInvestigations. The first narrative that we see used to frame the transition process is that actually what we're seeing under Mirziyoyev is a Uzbek Spring, which is something that echoes what happened in the Arab Spring, a flowering of democracy, etc. Except on this argument, rather than it being the product of a wave of a social movement, it's actually state operatives, senior state operatives from the former regime who've had a road to Damascus moment, and they have been inspired to implement a process that will bring to Uzbekistan deep democracy, human rights on a wide scale, and also an environment where entrepreneurship can thrive. So that's one narrative that has been presented. Another narrative is that this is a reformist authoritarian government, and that there are some very positive signs of change taking place, but we need to be sober in our appraisal of this change. We need to wait and see whether the raft of policy and legal reforms actually translate into meaningful practice. There's a third narrative, which is what I might call the old wine in a new bottle. And that is that, yes, under President Mirziyoyev, we've seen a bit of an international charm offensive. We've seen a much more economically savvy government, and we've seen a much less paranoid government when it comes to issues of national security. But ultimately, the previous structures remain in place. And another and a final narrative, and I'm not suggesting these capture everything, but another narrative is that that actually something pretty profound is taking place in terms of change, but it may not necessarily be emancipatory in nature. And that framing more or less looks at the fact that under Karimov, he was a very conservative leader and had very conservative policies during the transition from the former Soviet Union, and that under Mirziyoyev, we have a much more radical process taking place. We're seeing privatization, deregulation, internationalization of the economy, and the absorption of new financial, commercial, and industrial technologies into the country. And that's being done in a relationship with the authoritarian government that's shepherding through these reforms. And as a result of this process, what's actually happening is we're seeing something that might be described as the emergence of oligarchical capitalism. And that is a form of, we're seeing arise business groups who are rapidly accumulating wealth and power. And they are doing this in partnership with political patrons. So that's a fourth narrative. So what we've been doing at UzInvestigations is conducting investigative research into major business and political figures, into major business groupings, and into major significant initiatives and sectors in order to ascertain which of these narratives might be more plausible when looking at the facts on the ground, particularly when we're looking at power and the powerful. So an example of the sort of work we've done is that we did a recent report on Komil Alamjanov, who's a very prominent national figure in Uzbekistan. He would be very much an epitome of the Uzbek Spring narrative. He's someone who previously served as the press secretary for the President Mirziyoyev. He's been the head of the media regulator, and now he left that job to take up a role as head of a large NGO. And he's been an outspoken advocate for human rights, for media freedom, for open government, and for entrepreneurship. And when we began our investigation, though, we found some information that perhaps didn't quite gel with that public persona. So, for example, we obtained a leaked copy of a Cabinet of Ministers decree, and this decree wasn't published on the National Legal Database, and it awarded a major contract to convert real estate passports, paper real estate passports, into plastic smart cards. And it went to the GID group. And the GID group was ultimately owned by an opaque UAE holding entity. So we couldn't really find out from that holding entity who the beneficial owners were. But we did find out that the intellectual property, the smart card technology from the Intellectual Property Register in Uzbekistan, that was authored by Komil Alamjanov. And we put to him that fact, and he's denied any connection with the GID group. However, in addition to that fact, we also know that the GID group's address and telephone details are the same as other companies, which Mr. Alamjanov has admitted to founding. So, and I should say that that was a secret decree that awarded that project without tender. I should have added that. It was awarding a project without tender. And during our investigation, we also found other worrying examples. For example, when Mr. Alamjanov was the press secretary to the tax committee, the state tax committee, he established a number of businesses. One was a tax newspaper, and another was taxation software. And we found evidence from interviewing businesses that they were forced by tax inspectors to buy subscriptions to these services. Now, we put this to Mr. Alamjanov. We didn't know, of course, whether he was aware that tax inspectors were going out and forcing the public to purchase products, but we put that to him, and he responded via Twitter, which is such other times, and suggested that that he was aware that tax inspectors were promoting these kind of products, but denied that anything illegal took place. So that's one example of the work we've done, where perhaps some of the facts don't appear to gel and syncopate with some of the public image. Another example we looked at, and this is the last example that I'll use because I'm conscious of time, we looked at the cotton clusters in Uzbekistan. Now, cotton has been obviously a touchstone issue in Uzbekistan because previously it was run by the state, and the cotton harvest was picked using widespread forced labor. And President Mirziyoyev, in order to address this, has initiated a new system known as cotton clusters, where in effect now the production of cotton and its conversion to textiles has been entrusted to the private sector through these clusters. And so what we did was we went and analysed the companies who've been given responsibility for this new cluster system. And it was a mixed portrait, I will say that. There were, I don't want to be overly negative, there were some examples of some really good corporate operators who've been brought into the system, but overwhelmingly, there was more worrying evidence. So for example, one of the companies we looked at was Uztex, which is one of the biggest textile companies in Uzbekistan. And as we found out through our investigation, that company is owned by the Mamajanov family, or that group, should I say, is owned by the Mamajanov family. Now, you wouldn't necessarily know that from the share registry because most of the companies that are part of that group are actually owned by offshore holding entities and they're opaque offshore entities based in the UK, Singapore, and Switzerland. But we were able to get leaked documents, leaked emails from one of the major Swiss holding vehicles. And that strongly suggested that actually the controller of this group was an individual by the name of Fahud Mamajanov, who's a member of the family. And that was concerning for a number of reasons, because we also came across Russian court records where a whistleblower from a subsidiary of that group alleged that Mr. Mamajanov was involved in criminal activity, including corruption in Uzbekistan. And we also learned from Russian court records that Mr. Mamajanov's property in Russia had been seized or frozen by Russian authorities as part of the criminal investigation. And we got a range of other leaked documents that suggested that that group, Uztex group, were a part of some pretty irregular commercial transactions. We've put together other reports, and we've done reporting on the Mayor of Tashkent. I won't get into that. You can go to the UzInvestigations website where further worrying evidence has been brought forward. But I will say this, we've got a number of reports that are forthcoming, and I won't give them away, but what I've just discussed pales into insignificance compared to what we're about to document. And so that's a bit of a plug for the forthcoming work. And I think what that means is that I think we have to be very careful in terms of which narrative that I mentioned before that we accept as being perhaps the most accurate, because the narrative that we accept as being most accurate really informs where we put our policy attention and our support. And I think there's definitely reason to be somewhat to show a degree of caution when it comes to accepting that this is actually a regime that's committed to emancipatory politics. I think that there's definitely a lot of strong evidence to support caution. And I think that means that we should also not overlook, and I think what colleagues on this panel have said, is the profound and important role that civil society in Uzbekistan can play in emancipation. And because so much attention has been put on the government, I think civil society is being overlooked, and there's many courageous activists, journalists, advocates in Uzbekistan right now who desperately need support and resources. And I think that is where the hope for an Uzbek spring lies. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you very much, Kristian. That was a sort of mixed bag of comments, some positive and some hope for the future, and some words of caution for where we currently are. Can I just remind people that if they would like to ask a question, there's a Q&A box. We've currently got 2 very good questions in there, but it would be great to, oh no, we've currently got another 2, so that's excellent. Our fourth and final speaker is Adam Hug, who will be known to most of you as the director of the Foreign Policy Centre. Adam has been in that role since November 2017, and prior to that, he was a policy director at the Foreign Policy Centre from 2008 to 2017. And I know in his spare time, he's also a councillor in Westminster in London, and so may have to disappear. So don't think in about 25 minutes, if I'm not mistaken, for a few minutes.
5 minutes.
For 5 minutes, he has another, a small diary clash. Adam's research focuses on human rights and governance issues, particularly in the former Soviet Union. So over to you. Thanks, Adam.
Thank you very much, Alison. So delighted to have everyone here again. A couple of months on from when we first launched our Spotlight on Uzbekistan report back in July, and in that report we tried as much as possible to set out an overview of where we thought things stood after the first sort of 3.5 years or so of the Mirziyoyev presidency. And today we are taking a temperature check on the 4th anniversary of his election to the presidency, noting, of course, that he spent a few months as acting president prior to consolidating his primacy. So just to repeat some of the sort of overarching themes that we identified in our report of this of these 4 years. We've seen an economy that's moving away from the state-led autarky of the Krymov years, and there's been clearly been diversification in the private sector and opening of new opportunities for investment. But as I think Chris has alluded to in his comments, there are clear warning signs about some of the risks around the emerging privatization process. And I think there's going to be a need for a strong external supervision to guide this in a positive direction that helps create greater dynamism in the Uzbek economy and to prevent it from becoming a transfer of assets from the state to a politically connected economic elite. And the opacity of agricultural clusters that Chris mentioned just then, and also in his contribution to the report in the summer, show there are some areas of concern around opacity and that where clearly there's need to reform to make things more open. And I think there is a role that countries like the UK can play in terms of reforming some of our own mechanisms to improve transparency around some of the companies that a number of the things that Chris is working on and others have been working on have shown that there's normally at one step removed there is a link to some company registered in the UK, whether or not that's just a pass-through or whether that's something more substantial. So there's reform that we can do that can help reform in Uzbekistan. Uzbekistan's foreign policy has been transformed, with the country moving from sitting grumpily on the sidelines to taking a position of genuine regional leadership, befitting Uzbekistan's status as the largest country in Central Asia. And that's something that's coincided with a more distracted Russia and a sort of bumpy leadership transition in Kazakhstan that's dulled its previous regional leadership role. So that's clearly been a positive, and you've seen that during the COVID process. It's been Mirziyoyev who's been proactively taking the lead to try and pull together regional responses. And perhaps most importantly, given the focus of our work as an organisation and in the report we produced in the summer, we have seen notable expansions in civic and political freedoms and reductions in pressure on dissent when compared to the Krymov era. And that's a real genuine step forward. But as our publication in the summer showed, there is still a lot to do. Many ongoing problems, and there are a number of areas where it's unclear how much further the state is willing to change over and above what it's already done. And when we met in the summer, I think the takeaway was that in the area of human rights and civic space, there'd been clear improvements from 2017 to 2019, but that this year there'd been a somewhat uneven, that sort of uneven upwards trajectory had begun to plateau. And from what I think I've seen since we produced the report, the position has potentially declined, has I think declined over the last few months. And of course, every country on earth has had its systems of government tested rigorously by COVID. And the process has revealed both their strengths and weaknesses. And Uzbekistan had a relatively good first wave of the crisis in terms of keeping infections down, or at least the public figures of that down, and helping maintain social cohesion. although there were certain signs of future trouble bubbling under the surface in terms of the warning signs of increased media pressure on the media and concerns over forced participation in humanitarian relief efforts. But so I think during and since the second wave in the summer, you know, I think there has been real worries that the authorities are too often falling back on old practices. I think what was described as the smell of old Uzbekistan by one journalist recently. And the source of that comment was in response to pressure, including threats of legal action from Uzran Kodajayev, the Director General for the Information and Mass Communications Agency, against Kunuz and some other media outlets who had been reporting complaints by Uzbek citizens on social media about the lack of natural gas and sort of pressures on natural gas and energy supplies at the moment. This is despite the Ministry of Energy officially curtailing certain gas supplies earlier on in the autumn to help make preparations for winter problems. The fact there have been winter energy shortages in many past Uzbek winters, and the fact that obviously because of COVID, everyone is spending more time at home, which will put understandable pressure on the system. But when these issues were being raised in the press, the initial response of the regulator was to threaten legal action to try and shut down debate. And what's been interesting is not only the response of the old guard, of which the current Director General is potentially, the regulator is potentially seen to be part of, but also some of the messages from the reformist side of the regime, which seems to be, I'm paraphrasing here, to be that definitely shouldn't have happened, but that the response should be that the media should use your newfound freedom of speech to push back against that pressure from the regulator and other parts of the old guard, rather than saying, you know, it's the role of the president and other members of the regime to necessarily be at the forefront of stamping that out. I mean, there's clearly a balance between those two different things, but it's been very much that the first response is that that media should take it upon themselves to push back against those internal threats, rather than committing to stopping the abusive behaviour at source. And I think we're seeing public expectations that are built up for greater freedoms bumping up against the constraints of what I call previously sort of managed freedom. And I think the language of some of these reformers, again, who have at various points gone into bat on behalf of this new emerging free media sector against the excesses of sort of the older elements of the regime, even the language of these reformers is still quite paternalistic, i.e. that independent outlets and journalism is new, so that restrictions need to be removed gradually in the way of like teaching a baby or teaching a toddler to walk or whatever. And the guardrails on freedom of speech are there to protect journalists rather than about defending the state from scrutiny. And I think it's absolutely true that throughout the post-Soviet space and many other places, there is scope not only to help train journalists to improve evidence gathering and reporting standards, and ways to fund them better so they can actually spend more time developing their output. But I'm not far from convinced that that should give the state the right to determine what issues it isn't or isn't appropriate for the media to cover, to censor topics that it doesn't want to see reported on. So in terms of my sort of areas of concern, you know, so there have been a number of positive steps, but in terms of my areas of concern, it's this particularly recent chilling of the media freedom environment, which had previously been one of the areas of success for the new Uzbekistan, that I'm most worried about in terms of direction travel. Chris has talked about the issues around corruption, and I think that's got to be kept an eye on in terms of ensuring that the benefits of the economic reforms go to the wider public rather than just to a political elite. And Dilfuza touched on not only the rule of law issues, but some of the sort of social pressures that have been out there against women. And we've seen public debate on state TV and stuff like that, criticising women for what they're choosing to wear. And again, Uzbekistan is far from alone in Central Asia and or else, well, having those kind of debates. But there has been, pressure on women who are choosing to wear Western dress or sort of push back against the opening of space for women there, and also the concerns that Dilmurad has been writing about in our collection, and he spoke about today, in terms of the fact we haven't had real movement on NGO registration. That is a worry, because ultimately there's a fairly easy fix on that stuff, and there have been significant delays in transforming that system. So that's sends a signal that even those who are looking to reform the system are not as keen on allowing a wider flourishing of truly independent NGOs, because they could form alternative sources of legitimacy to the sort of very managed process of opening up that we've seen so far. So that's where I generally think things are standing, and I look forward to having discussion and questions.
Well, thank you very much for that really excellent comprehensive overview, Adam. We now have a lot of very good questions, which I'm delighted about. We currently have 12. So what I propose we do is if I read out 13, sorry, we're going up by the second. If I read out 3 questions at a time, and then the panelists can come in on the ones that they feel that they are most qualified to respond on. I also would quite like to abuse my position as chair at some point to ask a question as well, but I'll start off with the questions in the order in which they have appeared. The first question from, actually, if everybody can read the questions, then I can be extremely brief, which will save us some time. Alisher Alhamov's question about the contradiction in government policies. On the one hand, it looks supportive of women's rights, but on the other, it's restricting NGO registration. Alex Fuchs, hello Alex, haven't seen you for a long time, based on his own experience as an election observer, and he asks, what prospect do you see for further, more meaningful changes in the area of democracy and human rights? And Ewan Grant from London says, are there any cases of the government or its agencies seeking recovery of assets from Western countries, re dirty money in Dubai? See Tom Callahan's Bishkek-based Inspector Borbayev novel, so that's perhaps not. The actual question is, are there any cases of the government or its agencies seeking recovery of assets from Western countries? I will ask my question later on when it fits in with our more human rights based question. So Dilfuza, I'm mispronouncing Dilfuza and Dilmurad, if you would like to, perhaps Dilfuza, if you would like to start in responding to some of those questions.
Perhaps with the NGO, maybe Dilmurad can go ahead with that, and then I can take up the question of Alex, because I was also observing all elections and monitoring from previous elections and last year elections as well. But what I can see is perhaps the authority was not ready for true opposition this time, and that's why this was the reason why the 5th party has been created. It's an ecological party. So before it was only 4 parties, and there was a special seats, 15 seats for ecological movement. And this year in February, the new party, ecological party, has been created. So I think it's one of the reasons was, just to show that there's another political party. But on the other hand, I see good changes in gender equality. So we have more women now in the parliament. And I think this is one of the shifts. And I hope next elections, which will be next year very soon, there will be, true, maybe not the left opposition, however, some kind of equal to centralized governance opposition. However, I don't see any. Well, there are a few deputies, MPs now, who are fighting for their rights, like Kusherbayev deputy, who the prime minister, member of the parliament, who is very, very much outspoken and against of certain monopolies in the country. So yeah, this is a perspective that I see. I see it in a positive way, because previous elections, I was in Bishkek and doing a monitoring. It was interesting to observe, if I may say that.
Dilmurad, would you like to add anything on that, on the NGOs?
Yes, I would like to add on that question about NGOs and gender, women's rights. I think, it looks like a paradox. At the same time, like the government is trying to promote this gender equality, but on the other hand, there are still the process of registration of NGOs is kind of, I think it's designed to frustrate, because the groups, initiative groups, they apply like 3 times, 4 times, and they give up. From my point of view, I think it's related to, because there is a difference in the civil society in Uzbekistan, as Adam was talking about, like there are government-related or government-organized NGOs, and on the one hand, and there are self-initiative NGOs. So government-organized NGOs are created by the government decrees, or they are easily created, but at the same time, the self-initiative NGOs are it's very difficult for them to register. I think it's related to the existence of these government-organized NGOs, or gongos. I don't know. For example, we had the Women's Committee of Uzbekistan, which was responsible for women's issues, women's like gender equality and all the stuff. And they were merged into the Ministry of Mahalla and Family this year. And there was kind of a monopoly for their activities in this sphere. And they don't want to let other independent NGOs, maybe it's my own personal opinion, and my observation is that they don't want to. So if there is, for example, a women's NGO, which is already covering this field, there is no need for another NGO. So if there is a youth NGO, which is already doing the youth policy, or like supporting younger people, there is no need for another youth NGO or youth volunteer NGO. So it's kind of we are stepping in the monopoly of the government, where they would like to control this field. And there is no kind of freedom for others to kind of create their own independent organizations. So this is kind of my argument, I think.
Thank you. The question specifically on are there any cases of the government or its agencies seeking recovery of assets? I don't know if you'd like to go on to that one, Kristian.
Yeah, certainly. And I mean, I know that was a question from one question. There was another question that was very similar asked by Jagita around the assets of Gulnara Karimova, which obviously, you know, Gulnara Karimova was the is the eldest daughter of the first president, and a significant amount of her assets have been seized abroad, and there's currently a process of them being repatriated. And one of the big questions there is, can this money be repatriated safely back to Uzbekistan, given significant governance limitations in country when it comes to public finance management? And we've actually been looking into that. So UzInvestigations has been conducting a study looking at the domestic assets previously owned by Karimova and her associates to see what's happened to them. And so we've been tracing those assets and where those assets have ended up being seized by government. We've obviously been going to government asking, well, what has happened to these assets? Have they been used in a way that would be beneficial to the public of Uzbekistan and that would remedy some of the harms that have been produced by corruption? Or are they being potentially transferred in an opaque manner? We've put in freedom of information requests because there is a law in Uzbekistan that allows such requests to be submitted in a required legal format. To date, we've had no response to any of our requests for information on these seized companies, the court documents, the corporate, when they're under state management, the sort of essentially corporate documents that would be kept on these companies. None of them have been, we haven't actually got a response from the government, and that in itself is telling. We must have submitted over the last 2 years 24 freedom of information requests. We've only ever managed to get one response, and that was to state that the documents had been destroyed and were no longer available. So again, you know, it's really important that we press, you know, and actually explore practice as well as looking at the laws and the policies, and they don't always coincide. So there were real concerns about the government's capacity to transparently manage seized assets and to ensure that they're used in a responsible manner. But I think, you know, what we're seeing internationally is maybe some more positive news, because we're seeing, for example, a tranche of seized assets belonging to Gulnara Karimova being returned by the government of Switzerland. and they're trying to work with the government of Uzbekistan to set up an arrangement that will ensure that these assets are returned responsibly. And so they recently signed an MOU, and that MOU captured a lot of the really best practice principles, and stating that these assets will be returned in a transparent manner, an accountable manner. They'll be for the benefit of the public. They'll address issues. They should be used to help address issues around corruption. So the MOUs are really quite a remarkable document in terms of its intent. And now the challenge there will be whether they can actually design the protocols, the administrative protocols that live up to the very powerful statement that's been made in the MOU, and that will be much more tricky in light of the fact that there's a real desolate landscape when it comes to public finance management in Uzbekistan. And in terms of the question of whether there's more assets being seized by the government or from offshore locations, I mean, in certain circumstances like the UAE, you wouldn't. Maybe others here would know better, but I certainly don't know how you'd find that information out. A lot of that information wouldn't be made public, and so it's very difficult to know what assets may be seized at the moment and what's being returned in those sort of jurisdictions.
Thank you very much, Kristian. The questions are, there's many different themes, but if I could go to the theme of progress being made, possibly reversing Peter Frankman's question on whether or not the centralizing tendencies as a result of COVID are risk seeing a reversal of the progress made. Could I ask that question to starting perhaps with Adam himself and then going to Dilfuza and yeah.
No, thanks very much, Lasslett. I think it is a risk. I mean, we have, again, Uzbekistan would not be the only country in the world that is having that challenge as a result of the response to COVID. States that have a history of centralising their responses to things have been centralising their responses to things. The UK is no different to some of the challenges on that. However, obviously, it's different in the broader context. And I think you are clearly there is a shift that certain powers that have got those tendencies are using the crisis to reassert their role in the public debate and ultimately provide fairly simplistic solutions to shutting down potential dissent and pressures, because it's been a hard year for everyone being locked in. Obviously there is economic impacts for a lot of people, so it becomes more challenging to make the case that you should be opening up and being transparent. And again, parts of the regime are trying to make that argument, but it certainly seems to have strengthened the hand of those who would want to sort of reverse, or at the very least put a brake on the reform process. Can I just pick up on the question from the first one about political pluralism, because I think that's one of the key things going forward is, none of the independent opposition groups were able to stand for parliamentary elections last time. No one based abroad, despite the fact they are not believed to be particularly popular in Uzbekistan. There was a cast iron thing of you're not standing, even though you'd get 3 men and a dog voting for you. But there's also there'd be no opportunity for other independent groups to set up, and you have this sort of managed position where you had sort of 5 different flavors of pro-Mirziyoyev party, and at the moment it's a sense in which you could vote for each one of them, whether it's the ecological one, the 2 sort of shades of left and centre left parties, the right traditionalist one, and the pro-business party, to help modulate your policy mix. But what has been, people from inside the regime have been saying, this is a process and we are going to adapt this organically and give them more powers and give them greater ability to scrutinize and develop laws, so to sort of grow independently, organically. Now, there's some, as you said, Dilfuza identified 1 or 2 people who are taking advantage of the opportunities to push on certain things. But if we're not very careful, it is very much like the Russian model in terms of you have a range of different pro-presidential parties that give an appearance of opposition, and if it maintains at that level long into the future, that isn't a move towards democracy. So I think the jury is very much out as to whether this can grow organically to be more independent, particularly given that you have support for the president being uniform and a requirement of this process.
Thank you, Adam. Dilfuza or Dilmurad, but starting with Dilfuza, have you got anything you would like to add on that?
Yeah, I answered a couple of questions on Q&A section here, but yeah, maybe I will add next.
I can add on this.
If you would like,
yeah.
Dilmurad.
I think Peter is right in here saying that I think according to my observations as well, I felt that there is kind of a crackdown on the nonsense civil society and media because for example, there was there were ad hoc legal measures like related to reporting on COVID-19 numbers, like if a person was caught for false COVID-19 reporting, he might have ended up to 3 years in prison, for example. And this was kind of straining Uzbekistan's nascent media. And at the same time, the government was taking into control all the allocation of support and charitable support to vulnerable groups during the pandemic by creating the single center for coordination of support. So it's kind of I don't see that. I didn't see any freedom of civil society groups in their activities during the pandemic as well. Also, I'm really skeptical about a new draft law which was proposed by the Ministry of Internal Affairs, which is a new law on rallies, demonstrations, and kind of public gatherings. It is becoming, if this draft law is adopted, it would become really severely difficult to organize any public event, even a cultural event. So I think this was in the context of COVID pandemic, and maybe it's related somehow to this pandemic. I don't know, but this was happening this year as well. So, yeah.
May I add, please? So I would answer very legal thing, because there is a series of principles which is on derogation and limitations of human rights during the crisis or emergencies, right? So one of the things that ICCPR and Syracuse principles are saying, that any limitations on human rights or derogations from human rights has to have three criteria, the main criteria, right? So it shall follow the sunset clause. So it should be temporarily measured. It should be proportional to the crisis that is happening in the country. Then it should be non-discriminatory, and it should be by the law. So it should be the thing that is prescribed by the law, and people has to have an access to any limitation that is happening. And by the procedure, the government has to notify the United Nations on telling, or United Nations Human Rights Council, you know, the treaty body that telling about the limitations and derogations. So in Central Asian countries, only Kyrgyzstan announced it officially. However, many other countries adopted the law on emergency. Uzbekistan did not adopt the law on emergency. The second, all limitations and derogations happened in the country were circulated through Telegram channel. So if you open the Telegram channel that Dilmurad was mentioning, it has maybe 2 million people maximum. So it's not even a big chunk of the population of 35 million people, and then only 1.5 or 2 million people are sitting in the Telegram channel. So meaning that it's not popular. So not many people aware of the limitations. Then it was not prescribed by the law. So there was no publication of limitations by the Special Republican Commission on COVID. And lastly, again on the temporality. So as Adam and Dilmurad was mentioning, the criminal law, the criminal code, there was an amendment on March 26, 2020, which says there is a criminal charge for spreading the false information. Yes. And what is the false information? Which we don't exactly know. And yes. Spreading the false information in internet costs 10 years imprisonment. So it's very high charge for the vague criminal offense, or if we call it criminal offense on that. So I think in certain things, definitely it worsened the changes and worsened the situation with freedom of expression, freedom of freedom of speech, and many journalists was writing about it as well. But on the other hand, we see that, for example, vulnerable groups like people with disabilities, children, victims of domestic violence, they also were locked with the perpetrators and cut from the social security and social assistance, not only in Uzbekistan, but it happened around the world because the pandemic shut down the freedom of movement and a right to health. And I see it in everywhere. And special rapporteur on right to food, special rapporteur on right to adequate housing, special rapporteur on social security, these UN treaty bodies, they were all saying that such social crisis happened everywhere. So it's not unique for Uzbekistan. So my answer would be COVID impacted, so affected on backdrop of the reforms that happened for 3 or 4 years. On the other hand, it didn't, because it affected everywhere in the world. So, yeah.
Thank you very much for that. I'd like to ask a couple of questions now, specifically on development of human rights in Uzbekistan. My colleague, Aileen Walker, has asked the specific question, which you'll see here on whether you believe that there'll be positive change as a result of the National Strategy on Human Rights issued under presidential decree in June. And my question, slightly abusing my position as chair, is that you probably are aware that there's a new committee being set up in the Parliament overseeing human rights commitments in Uzbekistan, being chaired by Professor Saidov. And I just wanted to ask whether that committee, which I think is only just starting to do its work, whether it is reaching out to the NGO and legal community in Uzbekistan, and whether you believe this to be a positive step forward. Probably the most appropriate person is Dilfuza to start with that again, but on the NGO side, if Dilmurad could add a little bit on that, that would be fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I would say one thing. Human rights strategy, we as a legal community and a human rights community, we submitted our vision of how has to be changed, the strategy. However, it was not taken into consideration. So you may take a conclusion that this strategy was not completely driven from the communities, from the human rights defenders and etc. So I think the strategy is a good point for starting and opening up for communication, partnership, and mutual assistance to each other, like from international communities and human rights defenders. However, this is just a strategy, which means it doesn't have any legally binding nature of the document. So the human rights issues concerning judiciary mostly and interior. So if the strategy would allow for judiciaries to accept it, then it's another question. However, I don't see it that it's a legally binding document for any of these judiciary institutions. And about the Human Rights Committee, so from what I know and from the conversation with the human rights defenders and lawyers and activists for almost 3 and 4 years, I see that not many human rights defender groups are in such consultations. So they do not pick, for example, people who would have very critical opinion on human rights violations and issues. So I don't know how the committee will be composing, and will they be prominent lawyers that would be calling upon the human rights agenda. And another thing is, not many people would understand the international standards. not many of them are referring to international standards. So we, as an ICJ, did a big research that we'll be publishing very soon on access to justice on economic and social cultural rights. When we reviewed all these cases, accessible cases, we saw that there was no single reference to international treaties, while we are equal partner in the UN, and we ratified many core, let's say, human rights documents and treaties. So why the judges are not referring to any of the international instruments? This is also another question. So if, again, this is a question of education, capacity, and willingness to include. If the committee will be including such a group of people, I think it's a great development in human rights. But if not, again, there's no public information on how the composition is happening, what kind of questions we'll be reviewing. So it's still vague.
Okay, well, thank you. That's really helpful. Dilmurad, would you like to add anything on that particular set of issues?
Yes, I think the national strategy of Uzbekistan on human rights is a really good roadmap, and it included also the development of the code on NGOs, which I talked about. And there was actually a deadline. It should have been developed by 1st August this year, but I don't know, maybe because of the COVID pandemic, it was delayed again. And the first draft of this code was not really good, based on the feedback from the independent civil society activists in January. But still, it still is not published by the Ministry of Justice for the public discussion. And there was another one very good development about the creation of the public chamber under the President of the Republic of Uzbekistan, which would regulate the policies on development of the civil society. But the National Human Rights Strategy also included the development of the law on the public chamber under the President, but it still hasn't been done. And I think the deadline also passed, and I'm looking forward that this will be done next year, probably maybe not this year already. So, yeah.
Thank you. I would like to move now. There's a couple of questions on education that Richard Everett from the British Council asking what are the most pressing educational reform priorities for Uzbekistan. And sorry, I'm doing this on an iPad, and it isn't always the easiest time to scroll all the way down to get to but there was another question on education from somebody else. And then there was a question on what would be the levers, what would be the most useful help that the international community could give to Uzbekistan right now. Sorry, Steve King has got a question saying that there's been a number of positive changes in the education system in Uzbekistan. Would the panel agree that education is an area for optimism for Uzbekistan? I might actually start with you, Kristian, if you have views on education and indeed useful assistance that the UK could give to Uzbekistan or the international community, not just UK.
Well, I mean, I think, invariably the answer is yes. I mean, obviously building capacity is going to be critical, and you've seen a national higher education strategy in Uzbekistan. It's very ambitious. I think there is an awareness that as there are attempts to modernize commerce, finance, and industry, and also the civil service and professionalize the civil service, that needs to be supported by an ambitious program of higher education reform. And so I think that's absolutely seems to be a pretty accurate assumption to be making, or an inference to be making. And I guess the question is how do you incentivize a kind of vibrant higher education sector? And I think, one key thing, it links back to the question of human rights. You need to create an independent higher education sector. What makes the UK such a wonderful place to work? And I know people might be able to work my accent. I'm actually not from the UK. I'm from Australia, and I've thoroughly enjoyed it. I've been here for 15 years now, because the higher education sector here offers top-class researchers and academics a place where they can incubate research independently, that they can produce work with a whole range of different user groups. There's no political vetting of the work you do, and there's no centralized management. A lot of it is a lot of autonomy is given to academics and researchers to build cutting-edge research programs, cutting-edge degrees, and we do so in partnership with stakeholders, with industry, with business, with civil society, with community organizations. So that you need a whole bunch of freedom and independence to be able to do that. And I think, so I'd really ask Kristian, and what I've always been really worried about in Uzbekistan is I know there are so many amazing academics there, but whether they at the moment have that freedom to fully realize their potential would be one question. The second thing is, I mean, we've seen recently a whole raft of new universities being opened up, rushed through really rapidly. I mean, at an astonishing rate, where you see and they're private universities. And I'd really worry whether these universities, given they seem to be opening up overnight, their senior management are not what you would expect to see of a senior management of a quality higher education institution. They're not made up of academics with a lot of industry experience, with a credible track record of research and teaching excellence. That you're not going to get the quality of education you need through that medium. And you may see students getting shortchanged and the nation getting shortchanged. You really need a government who's prepared to invest in a public education system and one that is well funded and also free and independent.
Thank you. Dilmurad, would you like to add anything on education and international?
Yes, yeah, I actually would like to add, this is a really good question because as Kristian was mentioning about the independence of higher education, and during the last 4 years, I think I've seen a lot of new universities coming up because the share of the population which has higher education is very low, like about 10%, or it's increasing recently, has been increasing recently. But at the same time, I'm a bit worried because there is a priority for teaching, for example, economics or like political science. Political sciences was left behind for several years in Uzbekistan, and it was not taught. And there is a strong need for liberal arts or like education, because I think the government is nurturing this kind of initiative to study like hard sciences, like real sciences, as someone say. But I see the lack of humanities and social sciences, like sociology, social anthropology. All these kind of sciences are really left behind in Uzbekistan. And I myself, I received the funding from the Vanagran Foundation for anthropological research in the US, which also promotes this anthropology. And I would also like to promote like more qualitative and anthropological research in Uzbekistan, which appreciates discussion and argumenting, like rather than receiving knowledge as it is. I think knowledge is about making an argument rather than like receiving the knowledge as it is. So.
And Dilfuza, would you like to add on education and international assistance?
Well, definitely, I think that exchange is needed, and it's vital that professional communities also will be assisted. And maybe another thing is not only about higher education, but also about the vocational trainings, because not every single graduate of the school will have an opportunity to get a higher education. However, in the job markets, it's important to have a skills to have any kind of job. So vocational training, I think, would be one of the things that also international community and local government could also look at. And also about the job flexicurity, when the pandemic showed that classic division of the jobs probably not enough, and such social crisis or health crisis can actually eliminate from job opportunities. So that's why some of the new like skills trainings and this vocational trainings would be helpful, because like more than 2 million migrants came back to Uzbekistan and they do not have jobs here. And most of them do not have a higher education or even not finished school education.
I also
So,
would,
yeah, this
sorry,
is from my side.
I also wanted to add one thing. I just forgot about this, because I take it for granted because I always deal with disability and inclusion. But I think Uzbekistan can learn a lot from inclusive education in the UK at each level. So this is very kind of, Uzbekistan is still beginning to develop inclusive education at schools and universities. So I think we need to learn more from the UK's experience. Yeah.
Well, I'm hoping that's all useful information for Richard Everett from the British Council as well to take back from this discussion. Adam, I think you wanted to add to that.
Just very briefly. I mean, it's great the British Council are involved in this, because obviously they do have a whole range of cultural education products that are useful out there. Although I know there are issues in Uzbekistan about what they are and aren't able to do, as given their sort of arm's length link to the British government. But I think there is a real issue, as Dilfuza Kurolova pointed out, about the lack of social sciences. Part of that is obviously what the government's objective is. It's also about the appetite of international education providers to provide stuff that isn't their sort of high value thing. So international education providers are primarily in the market for the purposes of making money for their wider university or other education things. So they're going where they think the demand is going to be higher. So I think it's a two-way process of making clear that there would be demand there for those courses if they were to be provided. But I'd also add, I think there is one issue that we need to pick up on, is that there are Western providers that are active in Tashkent in doing this as a varying quality and levels of engagement between the home institution and what's being provided in country. But I think if a Western university is putting their name to an institution in Uzbekistan, they do share some responsibility for ensuring academic freedom on the campuses that are operating in their name. And I think there have been, again, some progress, but there are still some concerns about what students and academics are and are not allowed to say on campus and what not allowed to say in the classroom. And I think we've got to be mindful of that and encourage both sides, both the government to encourage that freedom from the side domestically, but also Western academic institutions to put pressure to push forward the academic freedom space, even when it's in business classes and stuff. There's a whole heap of things you want to be able to talk about a good functioning economy and society that sometimes there's a chilling effect there. So I think we need to try and push back on that.
Thank you. I'd like to turn to Willem de Beaufort's question on the difference between the cities and the provinces. And certainly in my own experience traveling around Central Asia, there's often an enormous difference between particularly the capital cities and rural areas. Would you like to comment, Dilfuza, on the difference that you feel now between rural areas and the cities in terms of human rights and democratic progress, and indeed practice of privatization, as William de Beaufort is asking in his question? And in particular, perhaps you might want to say a few words about what's happening currently in Karakalpakstan. Sorry, it was Dilfuza I was asking, but I will ask both of you, yes. Dilmurad and Dilfuza.
Yeah.
Dilmurad, you go first.
Yeah, I can reply.
Okay.
Yeah, this is a very important question, I think, that needs very deep consideration, because about 50% of the population of Uzbekistan lives in the rural areas, and the situation with the basic infrastructure in the rural areas is very not that good, I would say, and we also saw this from this recent crisis on the shortages of electricity and gas, and people are struggling to heat up their houses, as Adam was saying, especially in the time of pandemic. You spend more time at home, and the winter has been really early this year. And I was looking into, when I was in rural areas, I worked with vulnerable communities, with persons with disabilities and poor people and low-income people. And I faced this kind of a dilemma when we are campaigning for like accessibility for disabled people, for example, in the rural areas, but at the same time there is no basic infrastructure, for example, roads, or like roads are in a really bad condition, for example, and we are here campaigning for accessibility. So there is a need for economic and infrastructural development in the rural areas in the first place. And they are not, people in rural areas are not kind of, I would say, politically conscious, or kind of, they are not, because all they are thinking about is about their basic needs, like food and electricity and anything like this. So they are not going up the level of the Maslow pyramid, like they're thinking only about their basic needs now. And then maybe later on, for example, in Kazakhstan, they're already thinking about their political rights, the human rights. So there is no kind of space for them to think about this now, because they are really too busy about their basic needs. So I would say.
Dilfuza, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I would say that just to complement what Dilmurad said, people do not know their rights. So for more than, like, I started 1.5 years ago my own project, and I'm providing free legal consultations to people through online platforms, like from social media. I do not distribute my number, otherwise I would be not working and providing only free legal assistance. So from what I received for more than 1 year is that people just do not know how to protect their rights. They just even do not know where to go. For example, the question on the land, and this is one of the hot topics discussions in Uzbekistan on right to adequate housing. How they, well, land is not private, so it's a government land. There is a privatization process is happening, and the privatization is possible only for the businesses and people who own the property. I mean, in multi-store buildings, they do not own the land, but they have a property. And many issues are happening because of the illegal evictions and demolitions of the buildings for the public or government sake. You know, this is a housing issues. And of course, in Tashkent and maybe in Samarkand, Bukhara, you know, the central cities, they would maybe know their rights, how to go and protect their rights. But on other regions or even remote areas of even that regions, they would not know where to go, how to protect. And another thing is access to justice. So one is, it's not cheap. For just simple, if you earn $100 per month and your fee, just the minimum fee to pay to the court, it's $25. So 1/4 of your salary would go just for the payment of the court fees. And if you're living in the remote area, so you have to pay for your transportation, you have to pay for your food because you will be waiting, then just to write down, so you may come for a couple of times, and you don't have enough money to afford, for example, from rural areas, a lawyer. Another thing is about disability. If you're a disabled person, and many of the court buildings are not accessible for people with disabilities. And so, you know, this is things that even access to justice is threatening the issue of legal literacy of people. Yeah, this is from my side.
And Kristian, did you want to add anything on that particular point?
Just a sort of very elementary point that with the very ambitious economic targets the government has set, both in rural development initiatives and in urban redevelopment projects, you know, you're seeing and those ambitious targets are really dependent largely on the corporate sector, not on smallholders, not on small businesses. And so what we're seeing from the evidence on the ground is that when those corporate sectors are run by oligarchized circles, that is circles of pretty dodgy people running companies together, and whether it be in the rural area or urban developer, it leads to human rights abuses, it leads to fraud, it leads to all sorts of problems. When these companies are run by professional people of integrity, they can produce good outcomes. And that's also been displayed in Uzbekistan. So there's a real imperative, whether it be rural or urban, and to go back to Adam's point before, is, you know, it depends on rooting out kleptocracy, it depends on rooting out corrupt circles and nefarious organized crime circles from the legitimate economy, and ensuring that it's in the hands of people who have a commitment to the country, but also the commitment to ethical business.
Well, thank you. We are just beginning to run out of time. This is supposed to be finishing at 5:30. There's lots of questions that haven't yet been answered, but I think in broad areas they have been answered, and some of them have had written answers. So I would quite like to finish with quick fire answers to an anonymous attendee who's asked the question about the forthcoming presidential elections, because this is, after all, 4 years since Mirziyoyev became president. What are your predictions, and what do you expect any difference from previous elections? I'm going to start with you, Adam.
I mean, who's going to win? I mean, it's you know, the suspense is killing me. Well, I mean, I joke, but I mean, I've got to say I've not been following the mechanics of this, but obviously it would be, you know, is anyone serious going to be allowed onto the ballot to challenge? I don't know the answer to that question, and I think, you know, nothing. I mean, if you follow the example of the parliamentary elections, you would suggest that there isn't going to be. But quite how do you do that if yeah, it's are we going to go through the situation that you've had in certain other regimes where literally everyone on the ballot actually is supporting the lead candidate? Are we at that stage of that would not be a good sign for the future development of Uzbekistan's trajectory towards democracy. But that's a model that other Central Asian states have gone down in the past, and obviously has happened in Uzbekistan before. So we'll have to see how that pans out, and I'll be fascinated to see what Dilmurad and Dilfuza say on that. But it's a tricky tightrope to walk, because obviously if it is that transparently non-competitive, I think that would, you know, be it would undermine public perceptions that things are moving forward. But at the moment, you don't have a genuinely independent opposition movement that is able to politically organise as parties. I wonder whether they might consider letting someone from the new civil society movements put themselves forward as an independent candidate. But then again, there are barriers against independent candidates as well, I believe. I'm trying to remember, but yeah. So, well, interesting to see what mechanisms they put forward that enable it to be a more transparent discussion. But yes, as I said, I'm not expecting any massive surprises on the outcome. But you know, we're still in 2020. I mean, maybe 2021 will calm down a bit. But you know, if it was this year, we'd be wondering whether something weird might happen. But
what about you, Dilmurad? What are your predictions for the next presidential elections? Is he still there, Dilmurad?
Sorry, I muted myself. Yeah. It's not a joke. Yeah, it's a really interesting question, which I didn't think about. But yeah, I think next year we're having elections, but obviously I don't see any other candidate which would be suitable for that position now. Yes, and this also relates to the earlier questions about the political pluralism and the system in the whole, as the whole, because I think there are so many improvements in economic sphere, maybe changes and considerable changes in the economic sphere, but I myself, I didn't feel, I'm not feeling like really good, considerable changes in the political sphere. And This also goes back to the Gorbachev's like paradox. What to start first? Like you start politics first, and then you do economics after.
Well, that's not the perestroika first, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah,
the
so
Chinese model, or the yes.
Yeah, the Chinese model, or hated Gorbachev. I don't know. So, but I think there is a need because there is a need for political development as well. Because as the population, as there is an economic development, people will go up from their basic needs to the more kind of advanced needs on the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So there is kind of a like turning point at some level when GDP per capita reaches one high level, like a considerable amount level, and then people are thinking about their political rights. So I think it's not related only the system, but also people as well. So,
what about you, Dilfuza?
Well, I would just agree with the colleagues, and I don't wait elections of 2021, but I wait 2025. So
it's a very practical answer. I think you should say you have a future yourself in politics with an answer like that. Well, what about what about you, Kristian? Are you a perestroika person or a glasnost person? Or
well, I don't know. I've never thought about that question myself, but I was going to say, I mean, I was there for the last election and in the country, and I remember at the time, one of the things I would just go around and anyone who cared to talk to me, I'd say, you know, who do you think is going to win? Who are the other candidates? And very seldom did anyone even know who the other presidential candidates were besides Mr. Mirziyoyev. I think this time around, I think we're going to see a much more sophisticated stage management of the electoral process. I think there's going to be a greater effort to emulate the sort of, at least in a superficial form, the style of liberal democracies in like sort of Western sense, you know, publicized debates, opposition, not actual opposition, but rival candidates debating each other, and that will give a bit of substance to the sort of Uzbek spring crowd to sort of say, look at this is a real improvement on last time. And then there'll also be that specter in the background for critics to say, but actually there's no political opposition allowed, so this is really not a substantive political debate. But I think we'll know will be. Just let me put it that way.
Thank you. You got a small amount of interference at the end there, but I think we got the gist. So thank you very much to all the panelists. I think this has been a fascinating conversation. I've certainly learned a lot. And as I wrote in a blog about Uzbekistan fairly recently, the thing I'm most looking forward to is physically being able to go there again, to see for myself the changes that have taken place since my last visit, which it was about 2 years ago now, was the last time I was there. So I expect that there will be physical changes. I would just hope that there will also be continued development on human rights and political progress as well. So thank you very much, everybody. And apologies to anybody who didn't get their question answered, but I'm sure you'll manage to people can take up questions bilaterally afterwards via the Foreign Policy Centre, if I'm not saying something out of turn there. Okay, thank you very much, everybody. Bye-bye.
You too, Alison. Take care.
Thanks so much.
Thanks a lot, everyone.
Take care. Bye.